By the way, Daniel Bessner is already with us. So since you mentioned him, if you're cool with it, maybe we can go to Daniel now. I see like messages popping up on my screen next door. What's up, Daniel?
Hey guys, thanks for having me on.
Of course. No, it's.
I'm glad you dressed up for the big Jacobin show.
Yeah, no, naturally.
The hoodie and the beard. I mean, I shaved this morning. I got a haircut, you know. But yeah, no.
I don't own any other clothing, so this is what you get. With me, right. With me, you get what you get.
So Daniel Bessner is a historian, as Nando has told me several times, one of the smartest people he knows. Daniel, you and I are getting to know each other, but every time I've talked to you, you've like clarified some historical events that I've had questions about. So I was hoping that you can kind of help us dissect a little of what's happening in Nagorno-Karabakh and the war that's broken out there. And the Armenian side certainly considers it a war, considering all the weaponry that's now being given to the Azerbaijan government by Turkey. I think it's fair to call it a war. And then later we should focus a little bit about what Turkey is doing under Erdogan, how their foreign policy is changing and how they're kind of taking advantage of this vacuum that Donald Trump is providing for them. But first, let's get to the basics. So Nagorno-Karabakh is an region, mountainous region, that's predominantly occupied by Armenians, ethnic Armenians specifically, and has been governed by Armenians for a few decades now. There have been a number of, there's been hostility in that region for a long time because Azerbaijan feels that that is their land. I want to be clear about something. Historically speaking, dating back to 150 BC, ethnic Armenians have lived there. The majority of people living there today are Armenians. And so there's all this historical context I want to get to. But can you just describe what happened historically that led to the war that we're seeing today?
Sure. So this is an issue that goes back hundreds of years, with both Armenia and Azerbaijan being, in some sense, the crossroads of empires, being spaces that were historically dominated by different empires over time, whether you're talking about sort of the Russian expansions of the medieval period, the Ottoman Empire, or the Persian Empire over time. So these are spaces that have historically at least been dominated by outside powers. And I think that's important to remember, that in the era of nationalism, this is a deep historical memory of both countries. As the Ottoman Empire begins to collapse at the end of World War I, there's this surge of nationalism, right? When we're thinking in the United States, we think oftentimes of Woodrow Wilson and his focus on the creation of new nationalisms in Eastern Europe, and that's absolutely accurate, but this is actually a global phenomenon, whether you're talking about Egypt or you're talking about Korea, or whether you're talking about Armenia and Azerbaijan. So there's this surge of new nationalist sentiment that begins to happen basically during and after World War I. And in this fight, and I think it's important to remember, is that you have the coalitions that continue to affect what's going on today begin to form, where Russia effectively backs Armenia and the collapsing Ottoman Turkish Empire supports Azerbaijan. And during this time, Nagorno-Karabakh, and forgive my pronunciation if it's not particularly fantastic, but this is always was a major issue of concern for all sides, because it was traditionally an ethnically mixed region, and it's a mountainous region that's not so easy to control as mountainous regions generally are. And you could think on the border of Pakistan or Afghanistan, where the Pashtuns are. And so you see a lot of these issues occurring throughout roughly Central Asia or Southwest Asia. And I think that's really important. So what happens is that the Soviet Union, of course, eventually takes over or asserts political control over both territories, I believe in the early 1920s. And then what Stalin does very early on, I believe in 1921 or 1922, I think early 1920s, is that he actually gives the 1920s. I'm sorry?
Get your facts straight.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. It's the early 1920s.
Yeah, early 1920s, I believe 21. So he actually gives Nagorno-Karabakh to Azerbaijan. Um, and then a few years after that, it's actually carved out into what's essentially an autonomous region, an independent region, which is something that the Soviets are experimenting with in their early 1920s. There was actually discussion, for example, of creating an autonomous Jewish state. There were different Zionisms that weren't necessarily focused on Israel, and these are sorts of the experiments that are happening. But when Stalin creates this autonomous region, he creates a border zone where it makes the overwhelming majority of the population Armenian. But I think Azeris also think they have control of it. So this is like sowing the seeds of what's going to come to fruition 100 years later. So as the Soviet Union begins to collapse in the late 1980s, you get a surge of nationalism throughout what will soon become the former Soviet territories. And you get in Armenia, you get sort of oppression of Azeris, and in Azerbaijan, you get oppression of Armenians. So this is, again, sowing the tensions that eventually erupt when the Soviet Union collapses in the early 1990s, and you get these fighting, essentially a proxy war. And throughout all this, Russia continues its support of Armenia, and Turkey continues its support of Azerbaijan. And of course, there are deep anti-Turkic sentiments in Armenia due to the genocide, which killed about 1.5 million people. Which killed about 300,000 people, I believe it is. 1.5 million people, and also deracinated many, many more. So Armenia begins to associate the Azeris as sort of Turks, in a sense, that they're viewed as sort of aligned with the Turks. And of course, it's important to emphasize that the Azeris and the Turks are actually different in terms of their Islamic heritage, right? The Azeris are Shiites and the Turks are Sunni. But in the sort of the Armenian mind, they're very much aligned. And I think that that's actually true. And so there's a war in the early 1990s, and it basically focuses essentially on over Nagorno-Karabakh, right? So, guys, is everything clear? This is very.
No, I think this is incredibly helpful. I am a dumb person, right? I know very little about this conflict. Anna's obviously. It's much closer to her, but I think it'd be helpful for me and for the audience to understand a little bit of the geography of the region. So let's take the first shot, which outlines a little bit of what this looks like.
Here on the map, you can see Armenia to the west, Azerbaijan to the east. Both were part of the Soviet Union before it disintegrated in the early 90s. And right where we see the two meet is an enclave called Nagorno-Karabakh. In the eyes of the international community, it's part of Azerbaijan, but its population is now almost entirely ethnic Armenian. In the late 80s and early 90s, Armenia and Azerbaijan fought a war over Nagorno-Karabakh. And despite the UN calling on Armenia to withdraw its troops, by 1994, Azerbaijan had lost. Nagorno-Karabakh declared independence and became part of Armenia in all but name.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, so I want to actually jump in at that point, okay? Because what I'm having a difficult time understanding is, okay, so Stalin comes in, he gets to decide that there's this autonomous region that belongs to Armenians. But what we're hearing today over and over again is that, no, international community recognizes this land as Azerbaijan's land, and it is what it is, and let's just completely ignore the ethnic cleansing that took place. Let's completely ignore the fact that in the 1990s, well, before the 1990s, in 1988, this autonomous region voted overwhelmingly to join the country of Armenia. Right? And of course, Azerbaijan says, no, we don't want that. We disagree with it. Azerbaijan, by the way, wasn't a country until 1918. With the help of the Turkish government, they slaughtered the people of Baku, which is now the capital of Azerbaijan, right? And so the Armenians in this little sliver of land in this area want the right to self-determination. Again, they vote overwhelmingly to join Armenia and be part of Armenia as a country. And Azerbaijan doesn't like that. So more fighting, more war breaks out. And then you fast forward to the 1990s and Armenians win. They win, of course, with the help of Russia, but they're able to ward off the aggression by Azerbaijan and maintain that land as a land that is autonomous and that Armenia governs, that Armenians govern. And so how did it come to be that the international community decided, like, no, this area that's overwhelmingly populated by Armenians, governed by Armenians, actually belongs to Azerbaijan? How did that happen?
Right. So there's a big push after the Cold War not to change national borders. So I think that is basically what you want to think about it. Because so the Cold War ends and the United States emerges as a global hegemon. And one of the major things that people want to avoid in the United States and in the West, which is essentially dictating terms in a lot of these instances, is the changing of national borders. So that even though, and you could actually see something similar in Crimea, right? Crimea, which was historically Russian territory, but was given to Ukraine for various contingent historical reasons, is also, a major issue of dispute. So I think that's just really the general post-Soviet Union collapse desire to keep national borders as stable as possible in order to avoid what might offensively be termed sort of the Balkanization of the region. So I think that is a major reason why this is such a major issue. And then, of course, there are just parochial national interests. Like Turkey receives an enormous amount of its natural gas and oil supplies from Azerbaijan. So they want to support Azerbaijan. Armenia hates Turkey, and they continue to draw closer and closer to the Russian Federation after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the United States sells arms to both sides. So I think this is a region that's long been in dispute. There are intense ethnic tensions, and the international community essentially wants to stabilize it under what is viewed as sort of the preconditions of the region going forward. And I think that is essentially the reason why they wanted to do that. And what's interesting now is I think you have to put what's going on now in sort of the larger history of what I have begun to call the post-Cold War world. So that you figure the last 25 years or so, we've been living in the post-Cold War world. We're now seeing the emergence of new geopolitical alliances and new assertions of power in different regions of the world, particularly as the United States becomes relatively weak. And in this instance, the United States is seemingly less interested in what's going on in Central and Southwest Asia than it has ever been since the end of the Cold War, which is why you see, I think, what's going on now as essentially a proxy war between Russia and Turkey, particularly as under Erdogan, Turkey, it might be too strong to refer to it as a neo-Ottomanist foreign policy, but that's also not far off, where as Erdogan is trying to reassert Turkish hegemony in its region in a way that's similar to what the Ottoman Empire held before it collapsed at the end of World War I. And I think a lot of it's related to that. So instead of Turkey, embracing a ceasefire, it's saying that this needs to be settled once and for all, and it's supporting Azerbaijan. And Russia is very strongly supporting Armenia, because you're seeing what I think is the effective creation of new geopolitical alliances and geopolitical logics as the United States' hegemony is in relative decline. So the question is, to what degree is Erdogan serious about pursuing this sort of neo-Ottomanist foreign policy? And given what's been going on in this recent war, he seems pretty goddamn serious. And again, particularly because of the energy supplies that Turkey relies on from Azerbaijan, whose pipeline on the way to Turkey actually is very close to the Armenian border. So there's, of course, worries about if Armenia begins to expand its power, they'll be able to, threaten Turkish energy should they take over the pipelines in the region.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Anna.
I know. I'm sorry. I'm like really fired up about this topic. And for those of you watching who are saying that, because we covered this on TYT, and of course, Azeris are fired up about ensuring that their propaganda spreads online. And so thank you for your threats. They don't intimidate me. But I will say that, there's the issue that I have right now, of course, is everything that's going on concerns me. But historically speaking, Russia has been incredibly supportive of Armenia. that seems to be changing a little bit, right? Because Russia is supplying weapons to both sides. Now, they sell weapons to the Armenian side at a deep discount, but they also sell weapons to the Azeris at a marked up price. That worries me. You also have the issue with Turkey involved. They're supplying drones and other weaponry to the Azerbaijan side. And Kale, I'm actually going to skip ahead to the third video in this segment because it kind of gives you a sense of what all the different sides are saying. I want you to take a look at that, Daniel, and tell me what you think. Let's watch.
Here's Azerbaijan's president. We only have one condition, he says. Armenian armed forces must unconditionally, fully and immediately leave our lands. Armenia has no intention of agreeing. Here's its president.
What they are trying to do is to force Armenians out of the land that they historically lived, even before the Azerbaijan as a republic existed. So, but in my vocabulary, it's called ethnic cleansing.
And this intensification can be explained by looking internally and externally. First, domestic politics. In Armenia, this has been happening.
Unfortunately, the Armenian prime minister, I think, has been forced by his own domestic politics to back away from the framework agreement that had been negotiated for years between his country and Azerbaijan.
And then this is the situation in Azerbaijan.
With the social problems, with the falling price of oil, with the reforms that are needed in the economy, the war probably is the best possible outcome to make sure that public rallies around the leader.
So the domestic politics, I think, are relevant because with Azerbaijan, the Ilham Aliyev, the leader of Azerbaijan, is in a little bit of trouble because oil prices have collapsed. They're having a difficult time funding the social programs they have in their country. And so he's pivoted to a much more nationalistic ideology / messaging in order to garner support. And so now the focus is on basically taking over that land, Nagorno-Karabakh, which again has been governed by and overwhelmingly populated by ethnic Armenians. And what the president of Armenia said there is absolutely right. Armenians view this as a continuation of the ethnic cleansing that Turks took part in 1915. And so, where are Armenians going to go? They're going to be pushed out of the land that they've been living in to help Aliyev with his political popularity at home. I mean, that's the way that I view it, but I could be wrong. I want to get your thoughts.
Yeah, and I think what you said is really important because Azerbaijan has become fairly wealthy, especially when compared to Armenia in the last few decades, due to its energy industry, effectively. And if you actually look at Azeri culture, there's a lot of stuff sort of organized around a lot of popular culture organized around the wealth that's brought by like oil and natural gas supplies, to the point where there was actually a very popular Azeri, pop tune, I think called like Gasoline or Benzo or something along those lines. So it's a very important part. Yeah, hell yeah.
The Armenian Daddy Yankee.
Yeah, you know who I'm talking about, right? Yeah.
No, I don't.
So it's
Daddy Yankee had a song called Gasolina.
Yeah, no, kind of. So of course, but it's like literally a music video stationed at like a petrol station. So it's a very important part of the recent Azeri.
Sorry, I screwed that up. That was my fault.
No worries. As a Azeri national identity, and so as natural gas prices collapse, there's of course a lot of internal criticism that begins to emerge about the ruling government. So I think that's exactly right. And this is why, I might add, states all over the world, maybe like is too strong a word, but there's they like having sort of these peripheral wars because it serves as a valve on public discontent, whether you look at Kashmir in Pakistan or India, or what's going on in Nagorno-Karabakh in vis-a-vis Azerbaijan. So I think that that's exactly right. So that it allows a government, it allows a leader to sort of distract attention from internal problems by focusing on this hyper-nationalist war. And some could argue that's what Putin did during the invasion of Ukraine and sort of the actions in Georgia in the 2000s. So Anna, I think that's exactly what's fun about the situation. Turkey isn't backing down. Whereas in the past, Turkey has been like a little bit reticent about what's going on. Now they're like, this is a full throat. We're not only endorsing Azerbaijan, but we're saying we don't want a ceasefire. So that this is, I really think, a geopolitical conflict with Russia for regional hegemony in Southwest Asia. Like, the Soviet Union controlled this territory for roughly 70 years, and now Turkey's trying, and particularly under Erdogan and his hyper-nationalist neo-Ottomanist foreign policy, is once again trying to reassert hegemony in this region. So that's what makes it a real tinderbox, because if you could get something like Syria, where it essentially becomes a proxy war for other different interests, just like Syria is a proxy war for hegemony in the Middle East. The Azeri-Armenian conflict could become a proxy war for control over this super important energy producing region. So if you could start seeing literal, people coming in to fight the war, you could start seeing money go back and forth. You could start seeing, most damagingly, you're already seeing it, weapons flow into the region. And then you could have sort of this never ending low level conflict that goes up and down over time, but could literally last for decades. It's happened in a place like Kashmir. And this, I just want to add, is why I think after the end of the Cold War, you didn't get people trying to get the territory back to Armenia, because they wanted to just have these stabilized borders, this new world order, which was obviously naive in retrospect, but this was the goal. And what we're seeing right now, and this is why I'm calling it the post-Cold War order, the collapse of these sorts of regional agreements and regional alignments. And we're going to see more of that going forward as the United States' relative hegemony begins to collapse. And I think this is a harbinger of what you're going to see in places like in the Indo-Pakistan, China region, right? With like disputed territories becoming places where proxy wars are being fought by larger great powers. And of course, it's the local weaker states that suffer, because it's them who are going to be killed, and them in those regions that are going to have the weapons flow into them. It's already happened in places like Western Pakistan, and has happened for decades, and like what would be like Pashtunistan or whatever you'd want to call it.
Yeah, I'm struck by what you discussed, the post Cold War world, because toward the end of the Soviet Union, in the West, there was this kind of big push to sort of recognize these nation states, right? Like there was this kind of very simple idea that like national self-determination for like Ukraine and these kind of Soviet bloc countries is like this obviously worthwhile thing to do. Like, who could be against it, right? But I think that kind of push often unleashes these kind of nationalist forces and sentiments within countries. And sometimes it's like a little messy, right? There's people living. These national borders are not like set in stone from the beginning of time. They're kind of created pretty much ad hoc throughout history, and sometimes people get trapped on one side of the line and then the other side of the line. And when you kind of flare up these nationalist tendencies, the situation can get quite violent. And this happens like all over the world. You can count too many examples to count, right? But so what is the post-Cold? What is the theory around the post-Cold War world? Like what is the kind of impetus behind it, and what is it? How's it going to shake out?
How's it going to shake out?
Not how it's going to shake out, but like, you know what I mean? Like, what are the conflicts at play?
No, I think that's right. And just before I get to that, I think this is something you also see typically with mountainous regions, which are often ethnically mixed and are often very difficult to control. I mean, you see it in the 19th century with the mountainous regions of Italy. If anyone remembers the beginning of Godfather Part 2, right? Like the Don's father was fighting in a mountainous region because you could hide in mountainous regions, like Bin Laden did, for example. So I think these are also like tinderboxes just because of geography. What I would say the post-Cold War is going to be defined by is essentially regional struggles for hegemony between what might be called medium powers. So, for example, as Russia and the United States assert in the Middle East, I think probably over time less, you're going to see more fighting between Saudi Arabia and Iran. As the United States retreats from Southwest Asia, Central Asia, you're going to see more fighting between Turkey and Russia. As the United States' hegemony in East Asia and South Asia becomes less and less, you're going to see more fighting between India and China, which are potential great powers, which are just not as powerful as the United States. And so I think we're turning to not returning. We're entering a strange world where there is still one overwhelming military power, which is the United States. We all know the number is 750 military bases, an incredible amount spent on its military. But while at the same time, the government itself of the United States becomes less and less interested in asserting actual hegemony, which leads or provides openings to medium to small great powers to begin to assert themselves in the region. That's what I think we're going to begin to see. And then the question is, to what degree does China, for example, win its struggle with India? To what degree does Turkey win its struggle with Russia? I think that will be played out over the next 10, 20, 30 years.
So one thing I wanted to add to what Nando said is, Nando, I think you make a good point, but you do have to kind of look at the situation on a case-by-case basis, because in the situation of Armenians and Nagorno-Karabakh, we're not just simply talking about similar people with similar religions living in the same region. Armenia is specifically a Christian minority surrounded by Muslim enemies. And so that's part of the reason why the people of Nagorno-Karabakh want to be part of Armenia, because again, we're talking about ethnic Armenians who overwhelmingly identify as Christians, and they're being pushed out of the land that they've lived in for centuries, literally centuries. And so that's part of the reason why they want self-determination. They've been brutalized by, Muslim Turks, dating back centuries. So that's part of the problem here.
I want to be very clear. I was not suggesting otherwise. I mean, I think that the sort of the phenomenon I was talking about was like this kind of the sort of 1980s thing where like the existing national boundaries were kind of like set in stone. So like again, like you see situations like Crimea, where like the majority of the people there are Russians, and like they're not necessarily Ukrainians. They don't necessarily like it,
right.
But if you took it the existing national boundaries that anti or whatever, like there's this thing called Ukraine, and if you just take the majority of people there, they're like, yeah, sure, we want the Crimea, and if they what I mean, like, so there's like this feeling of like of the existing kind of I guess 1991 or whatever national boundaries as these kind of set in stone things that are just like the way they are. I don't know, like there was this feeling that there was like that there wasn't this weird this kind of analysis that sometimes these situations are messier than you can just see like lines on a map.
Okay, now I get what you were saying. Okay, I misunderstood what you were saying, but yeah, you're absolutely right about that, which is why I feel a lot of frustration when I see the way Western media covers this story, because they absolutely ignore any and all historical context when discussing this, and they just simply say, well, this region is internationally recognized as Azerbaijan, so let's move on. No, but it's way more complicated than that, and the ramifications of just accepting that and ignoring the fact that that area has overwhelmingly voted to join Armenia and is overwhelmingly populated by ethnic Armenians who do identify as Christians, surrounded by Muslim enemies. That's relevant. That's relevant to what's happening in that area right now. And then, I do also want to just quickly talk about, and I think this is a good transition because we should focus on Turkey outside of what it's trying to do to Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh. But Donald Trump has an incredibly friendly relationship with Erdogan of Turkey. He has business ties to him. Ivanka Trump also has some business dealings with Azerbaijan. And so that's certainly concerning when you look at how these types of conflicts in the past have been negotiated by what's referred to as the Minsk Group. And it's led by France, the United States, and Turkey. Now, the United States played a pretty important role in kind of doing what it could to negotiate ceasefires, negotiate some calmness in that area. Donald Trump, though, is not only a buffoon, but has his own self-interests in mind. He was asked about this conflict, and here's his ridiculous and ignorant answer.
And there has been going on the military action in the Karabakh, Azerbaijan, and
in where?
The Azerbaijan, the Karabakh, and the civilians are killed. And according to the officials from the Azerbaijan, they say the first shoot came from the Armenian. What's your comment on that?
So we're looking at it very strongly. It just happened, and I know about it. learned about it today and yesterday, and we're looking at it very strongly. We have a lot of good relationships in that area. We'll see if we can stop it.
Yeah, the good relationship he's referring to is specifically with Erdogan. And if you guys can remember, not too long ago, Donald Trump had a phone conversation with Erdogan. Shortly after that, cleared U.S. troops from northeastern Syria, essentially paving the way for Erdogan to send, his troops to the region to slaughter Kurds, who, were our allies. And so if Erdogan has that kind of sway over Trump, I am concerned about what this means for the fate of ethnic Armenians living in that region.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And then this is really what bolsters the argument for this neo-Ottomanist foreign policy, is that Erdogan is challenging Russia in places like Syria and Libya, where he's really making a play for this Ottoman territory, the territory that used to be controlled by the Ottoman Empire for centuries. He seems to be saying that we, Turkey, are really going to try to assert hegemony over this region. But at the same time, he's also making sort of sops, I can't think of a better word, but sops to the West, right? Like if you look at the development of Turkey's foreign policy toward Israel over the last 20 years, it's essentially reversed to a relatively anti-Israel foreign policy to a relatively pro-Israel foreign policy, at least in my understanding of the issue. So I think that what Erdogan is trying to do is he's trying to ingratiate himself with Western powers in an attempt to reassert within the actual geopolitical conditions a neo-Ottomanist hegemony over regions in which Turkey historically had significant influence, like, for example, North Africa, like, for example, Southwest Asia. And so then the question is, to what degree is he going to be able to do this? And I think that's really a very open question. And just one final point, you see this also in sort of Turkey's turn away from the EU. If you remember in the 2000s, there was like a very big push for Turkey, within Turkey, for it to become part of the European Union. And the Europeans essentially said no, that they weren't going to have a powerful Muslim polity in the EU. And so you get basically a turn eastward as opposed to a turn westward, which came along with this neo-Ottomanist foreign policy, if that's what you want to call it.
Wow.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Erdogan,
maybe Trump was influenced by the flash mobs. I remember when Erdogan hired a bunch of flash mobs in New York. Do you guys remember this story? No. So
no.
In order to do I guess there was the resolution in Congress to recognize the Armenian genocide, and Erdogan financed like a propaganda campaign in the United States, and part of it was like the sky writing thing, and also did flash mobs in DC and New York of people like being like, vote no on the
it's disgusting.
It's just so
disgusting.
Crazy.
Yeah, and then we didn't get into even like the fact that the United States sells a lot of things to both Armenia and Azerbaijan, and there's an Armenian lobby in the United States as well, which is constantly disappointed with Congress, not recognizing the Armenian genocide as such, which is, I think it was 2014-ish, 2013 or 2014 was the closest that the United States came to recognizing it, but it eventually didn't. Samantha Power actually writes about this in her book, where Obama was just like, you cannot recognize it, which, is really interesting. Yeah.
And not just Obama. I mean, something very similar happened under the Trump administration, where I don't remember if it was the House or the Senate, so I apologize for that. But Donald Trump intervened and told the GOP, under no circumstances should you recognize the Armenian genocide. And it's because of our, this country's, America's, strategic interests in aligning itself with Turkey. But I actually didn't know that the United States was selling weapons to both sides. That's true, really?
That's my understanding. Let me check. Yeah, I'm almost positive. Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. U.S. sells weapons.
If I'm wrong, I apologize, but that's my understanding.
No,
I know that Russia
makes
is.
Sense.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I thought the U.S. was as well, but I may be wrong on that. I'm not a hyper specialist in this region.